Have you ever noticed that strange contradiction? How suffering, the very thing our bodies and minds naturally avoid, has somehow been transformed into something noble, virtuous, even sacred. It's one of those patterns that hides in plain sight, so deeply embedded in our cultural consciousness that we rarely stop to question it. Think about the language we use: noble suffering, purification through pain, redemptive sacrifice, no pain, no gain. There's something almost suspicious about this glorification. Why do we consistently celebrate as virtuous the very experience that every fiber of our being naturally resists? The contradiction extends beyond mere language. The martyrs we venerate for their suffering, the saints celebrated for their self-inflicted pain, the widespread belief that true character emerges only through hardship, the notion that those who suffer most somehow gain special insight or moral authority. In each case, pain is transformed from natural adversity into spiritual asset. There's something peculiar about this pattern, a suspicious correlation that warrants deeper investigation. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently religious and moral traditions frame suffering as spiritually beneficial. Blessed are those who mourn. Take up your cross daily. Through suffering comes purification. These aren't random spiritual insights, but follow a systematic pattern. Suffering is consistently equated with spiritual advancement, with moral development, with divine favor. There's something almost too convenient about the consistency of this framing. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if the sanctification of suffering serves purposes beyond spiritual growth? What if the transformation of pain into virtue isn't a profound spiritual truth, but a sophisticated psychological mechanism serving interests quite different from human flourishing? What if pain was made sacred, not to elevate humanity, but to make suffering bearable, and in doing so, perpetuate systems that depend on human sacrifice and submission? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of our moral frameworks, our spiritual traditions, and our fundamental understanding of virtue itself. If we've been taught to value suffering as spiritually purifying, how might this distort our approach to our own pain and the pain of others? If pain has been sanctified for purposes beyond our flourishing, what might become possible if we distinguish between unavoidable suffering and its unnecessary glorification? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of morality? A philosopher who dared to ask whether our most cherished values might actually be serving very different purposes than we imagine. A thinker whose own intimate familiarity with suffering led him to question its supposed spiritual benefits. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind the sanctification of suffering often lurks something much less divine, the sophisticated transformation of pain into a tool for psychological and social control. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to separate suffering from virtue? Could it be that entire moral systems have benefited from keeping these concepts intertwined? What if the ultimate subversion isn't finding meaning in suffering, but questioning whether suffering should be meaningful at all? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about virtue, spirituality, and the human condition. They offer a perspective on suffering not as spiritual necessity, but as psychological tool that has been weaponized against human flourishing. Are you ready to follow where they lead? As we embark on this journey, consider a disturbing possibility. What if pain isn't sacred at all? What if suffering doesn't purify, but merely domesticates? What if the greatest deception in human history has been the transformation of pain into virtue, not to elevate humanity, but to make humans more tolerant of their own diminishment? There's a striking pattern in how suffering is conceptualized across moral and religious traditions that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between pain and virtue, between suffering and spiritual advancement, between sacrifice and moral worth. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how the concept of suffering has been systematically transformed from natural adversity into spiritual asset. Consider how suffering is framed in religious traditions. In Christianity, the central symbol is the crucifixion, literally the torture and execution of its founder. In Buddhism, the first noble truth is that life is suffering, dukkha. In Hinduism, ascetic practices involving self-inflicted pain are paths to spiritual advancement. In various traditions, fasting, self-flagellation, physical deprivation, and voluntary poverty are celebrated as spiritual disciplines. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Suffering isn't merely endured, but actively embraced as path to virtue. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse contexts. The specific theological details change, the cultural expressions shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Suffering is systematically transformed from natural adversity into spiritual opportunity. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in moral hierarchies. Those who suffer most voluntarily, the martyrs, ascetics, and self-sacrificing servants, occupy the highest positions in moral hierarchies. The good person is often the one who sacrifices most completely, who denies themselves most thoroughly, who endures hardship most willingly. In each case, moral worth is measured by willingness to embrace suffering. The pattern persists. Pain isn't merely endured, but actively valorized as measure of virtue. The anomaly extends beyond individual assessment into social expectations. The poor are praised for their uncomplaining endurance of hardship. The sick are admired for their cheerful acceptance of suffering. The oppressed are celebrated for their dignified forbearance of injustice. The pattern repeats. Suffering isn't merely a condition to be addressed, but a virtue to be cultivated and admired. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss virtue, morality, spiritual growth, and character development at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation, how consistently suffering has been transformed from natural adversity into moral asset. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how pain has been systematically sanctified across diverse moral and religious traditions. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that the sanctification of suffering might be serving purposes beyond spiritual growth or moral development. What if pain has been made sacred, not primarily to elevate humanity, but to make suffering bearable, and in doing so, perpetuate systems that depend on human sacrifice and submission? This is the question that haunted a 19th-century philosopher whose insights into human psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether our most cherished moral values might actually be serving very different purposes than we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between suffering and virtue? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if suffering isn't inherently meaningful or purifying? What if pain has been sanctified primarily to make it bearable for those who cannot escape it, and in doing so, reduced their motivation to challenge the systems that perpetuate unnecessary suffering? These questions lead us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. Suffering does not purify, it merely domesticates. In the winter of 1879, Friedrich Nietzsche found himself in a state of physical agony. At 35, he was suffering from debilitating migraines, severe stomach ailments, and deteriorating vision, conditions so painful that he would spend days confined to darkened rooms, sometimes unable to read or write for weeks at a time. He had recently resigned his professorship at the University of Basel due to his health. His books were largely ignored by the intellectual establishment, and he lived in near poverty, moving between cheap lodgings as his meager pension allowed. By conventional standards, Nietzsche's life appeared to be defined by suffering. It was within this context of intense personal pain that Nietzsche began to formulate his most penetrating insights about the psychological function of suffering in moral systems. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine the relationship between pain and virtue. Having grown up in a devoutly Lutheran household, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of how Christian morality framed suffering as spiritually beneficial. Yet his own experience of relentless physical pain had led him to question this framing, to ask whether suffering actually delivered the spiritual benefits that moral traditions promised. What made Nietzsche's perspective on suffering especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man intimately familiar with pain, with the psychological temptation to find meaning in suffering, with the natural human desire to transform adversity into opportunity. Each day, as physical agony racked his body, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Does suffering actually purify, elevate, or ennoble, or might these supposed benefits be sophisticated illusions serving purposes quite different from human flourishing? During his periods of relative relief from pain, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights, that the sanctification of suffering within moral systems serves psychological and social functions far different from those explicitly claimed. Rather than seeing the valorization of suffering as spiritual insight, he recognized it as revealing something profound about how moral systems function, not to enhance human flourishing, but to make suffering bearable by giving it meaning, and in doing so, reducing the motivation to challenge systems that perpetuate unnecessary pain. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis, that suffering doesn't actually purify or ennoble, but merely domesticates. That pain has been sanctified not to elevate humanity, but to make humans more tolerant of diminishment, more accepting of constraints, more willing to endure conditions that perhaps should not be endured at all. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's own wrestling with suffering and meaning. Each day, as he faced physical pain with uncertain prospects for improvement, he confronted the temptation to find spiritual meaning in his suffering. Each day, he observed in himself the very psychological mechanism he was describing, the human tendency to transform unavoidable pain into meaningful sacrifice, rather than confronting the possibility that some suffering might be meaningless, purposeless, and better eliminated than endured. It was this personal confrontation with suffering that gave Nietzsche's philosophical insights their unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely analyzing moral concepts academically, he was uncovering their psychological function through his own lived experience. As he would later write in Ecce Homo, "I know more about suffering than the saints, because suffering never kept me from life." This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how suffering had been transformed into virtue within Western moral traditions. It wasn't merely a critique of religious morality, but a profound psychological insight into how the sanctification of suffering functions far different from those explicitly claimed. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for how we understand virtue, morality, and the human condition itself? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of religious texts and moral traditions. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how the concept of suffering had been framed across Western moral history. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice: the systematic transformation of pain from natural adversity into spiritual asset. In On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. The sick are the greatest danger for the healthy. It is not from the strongest that harm comes to the strong, but from the weakest. This deceptively simple statement reveals Nietzsche's recognition that moral systems often invert natural values, transforming weakness into moral strength, suffering into virtue, pain into spiritual asset. This inversion doesn't enhance human flourishing, but serves other psychological and social functions. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying the moral valorization of suffering, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its psychological function, how the sanctification of pain serves to make suffering bearable for those who cannot escape it, and in doing so, reduces their motivation to challenge the systems that perpetuate unnecessary suffering. Suffering hasn't merely been endured, but actively transformed into virtue precisely because this transformation serves particular psychological and social purposes. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in Christian texts and traditions, where suffering was consistently framed as spiritually purifying, as path to divine favor, as evidence of moral worth. He noted how the central symbol of Christianity, Christ on the cross, literally sanctified torture and execution, transforming the ultimate physical agony into the supreme spiritual triumph. Rather than seeing this as spiritual insight, he recognized it as revealing something profound about how moral systems function, not to eliminate suffering but to make it meaningful, and in doing so, more bearable. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of Christian moral psychology, particularly in On the Genealogy of Morals. There, he traced how Christian morality had developed sophisticated conceptual frameworks that transformed natural human adversity into spiritual opportunity. Concepts like redemptive suffering, purification through pain, and the refiner's fire didn't actually eliminate suffering, but rather gave it meaning, making it more psychologically bearable without necessarily addressing its causes. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how the sanctification of suffering manifested in social structures. He noted how consistently the valorization of pain served to maintain existing power arrangements, teaching those who suffered under these arrangements to find meaning in their pain rather than challenging its unnecessary perpetuation. The pattern was remarkably consistent. What was called virtue often functioned primarily as a sophisticated mechanism for making oppressive conditions more psychologically tolerable. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the moral valorization of suffering often functions psychologically not to elevate humanity, but to domesticate it, to make humans more tolerant of diminishment, more accepting of constraints, more willing to endure conditions that perhaps should not be endured at all. As he writes in Twilight of the Idols, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," a statement often misinterpreted as celebration of suffering, but actually intended as recognition that resistance to unnecessary pain, not its passive acceptance, creates strength. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across religious texts, moral traditions, and social structures. From Christ on the cross to the celebrated martyr, from the beatified saint to the uncomplaining poor, the same correlation appears. Suffering is systematically transformed from natural adversity into spiritual asset. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound: how the sanctification of suffering serves particular psychological and social functions, primarily making pain bearable for those who cannot escape it, and in doing so, reducing their motivation to challenge systems that perpetuate unnecessary suffering. The beautiful mask of redemptive suffering conceals a much less beautiful reality: the sophisticated use of meaning as tool for psychological and social control. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the sanctification of suffering extended far beyond explicit religious contexts into the very psychology of Western humanity. Even in seemingly secular contexts, he found the same underlying pattern at work: the transformation of pain from natural adversity into moral virtue. The specific language might change, but the psychological function remained consistent. Suffering was systematically valorized as spiritually beneficial, as character building, as evidence of moral worth. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885, Nietzsche expanded this analysis through his concept of the preachers of death, those who teach that suffering in this life will be rewarded in another, that pain now leads to pleasure later, that sacrifice today brings salvation tomorrow. They meet an invalid, or an old man, or a corpse, and immediately they say, "Life is refuted." Their wisdom speaks thus: "A fool, he who remains alive." This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the valorization of suffering often functions to devalue life itself, teaching people to find meaning in their pain rather than seeking to eliminate unnecessary suffering and enhance vital flourishing. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this psychological pattern wasn't merely religious, but revealed something fundamental about how morality functions. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "He who fights with monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster." This isn't merely cautionary wisdom, but profound psychological insight. Moral systems that sanctify suffering risk turning humans against life itself, teaching them to see pain not as natural adversity to be overcome, but as spiritual opportunity to be embraced. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how moral systems control human behavior, not primarily through external constraints, but through the internalization of values that transform natural human responses. By sanctifying suffering, moral traditions create internal psychological mechanisms that make humans more accepting of pain, and thus less likely to challenge systems that perpetuate unnecessary suffering. When people believe that pain is spiritually purifying, they become more willing to endure conditions that perhaps should not be endured at all. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that suffering doesn't purify, but merely domesticates. That pain has been sanctified not to elevate humanity, but to make humans more tolerant of diminishment. As he writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't crude celebration of power, but recognition that authentic human flourishing emerges from vital affirmation rather than from the moral glorification of weakness, suffering, and self-denial that religious traditions often celebrate. The pattern became increasingly clear. Suffering had been systematically transformed from natural adversity into spiritual asset, precisely because this transformation serves particular psychological and social functions, primarily making pain bearable for those who cannot escape it, and in doing so, reducing their motivation to challenge systems that perpetuate unnecessary suffering. By teaching people that their pain has meaning, moral systems make suffering more psychologically tolerable without necessarily addressing its causes. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological power of moral systems lies precisely in their ability to transform natural human responses into their opposites. As he writes in Daybreak, morality is nothing other than obedience to customs, but customs are the traditional way of behaving and evaluating. This isn't merely academic observation, but profound psychological insight. Moral systems function by transforming natural human responses, like the avoidance of pain, into their opposites, creating sophisticated psychological mechanisms for controlling behavior. What implications might this understanding have for how we approach suffering, virtue, and human flourishing? And what might it reveal about the possibility of values beyond the moral sanctification of pain? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse domains of human experience. The sanctification of suffering wasn't isolated to particular religious contexts or moral traditions, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout Western culture. The pattern was clear. Wherever pain appeared, moral frameworks transformed that pain from natural adversity into spiritual opportunity, from meaningless suffering into meaningful sacrifice. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that it is this discipline alone that has created all enhancements of man so far? This passage is often misinterpreted as Nietzsche's endorsement of suffering's value, but in context, it reveals his recognition that moral systems consistently attribute human development to pain rather than joy, to adversity rather than flourishing, to sacrifice rather than affirmation, a pattern so consistent it warrants deeper investigation. The pattern revealed itself in how physical illness was conceptualized. Rather than seeing sickness merely as natural adversity to be overcome, moral traditions consistently framed it as opportunity for spiritual growth, as test of character, as occasion for moral development. The pattern continued. Natural adversity was systematically transformed into spiritual asset, making suffering more bearable by giving it meaning. In economic hardship, the same pattern appeared. Poverty wasn't framed merely as material deprivation to be addressed, but as spiritual condition with moral benefits. teaching patience, humility, detachment from material concerns. Those who suffered economic hardship were encouraged to find meaning in their suffering rather than challenging systems that perpetuated unnecessary economic deprivation. The pattern persisted. Pain was sanctified in ways that made it more psychologically tolerable without necessarily addressing its causes. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in social oppression. Those suffering under unjust social arrangements were consistently encouraged to find spiritual meaning in their pain, to develop patience, forbearance, forgiveness, and other virtues that made their suffering more bearable without challenging its unnecessary perpetuation. The pattern repeated. Suffering was systematically transformed from condition to be eliminated into opportunity to be embraced. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across contexts. Whether in illness, poverty, or oppression, the same psychological mechanism operated. Pain was sanctified in ways that made it more bearable for those who couldn't escape it, reducing their motivation to challenge systems that perpetuated unnecessary suffering. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. This isn't mere provocation, but profound insight. Human development requires overcoming moral frameworks that sanctify suffering rather than enhancing vital flourishing. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that behind many of our most cherished moral values often lurks something much less noble, the sophisticated use of meaning as tool for psychological and social control. The sanctification of suffering doesn't actually purify or ennoble. It merely domesticates, making humans more tolerant of diminishment, more accepting of constraints, more willing to endure conditions that perhaps should not be endured at all. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if many of our moral frameworks, spiritual traditions, and cultural narratives have evolved primarily not to enhance human flourishing, but to make suffering more bearable, and in doing so, reduce motivation to challenge systems that perpetuate unnecessary pain? What if the concept of redemptive suffering serves not primarily to elevate humanity, but to domesticate it, to make humans more accepting of their own diminishment? This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand virtue, morality, and human flourishing. If we've been taught to find meaning in suffering, what might become possible if we distinguished between unavoidable pain and its unnecessary glorification? What form of human development might emerge if we stepped beyond moral frameworks that sanctify suffering and embraced values based on vital affirmation rather than self-denial? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond philosophical curiosity, into the very heart of how we understand virtue, morality, and human flourishing. If suffering has been systematically sanctified within moral traditions, then addressing this pattern requires more than merely questioning specific moral teachings. It demands a fundamental reconsideration of how we approach pain, adversity, and the development of human potential. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of moral duty, willingly taking on suffering as spiritual burden. The lion represents the courage to say no to these moral distortions, creating space for something new. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for saying yes to life, and developing values beyond the moral sanctification of suffering. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond the glorification of pain requires not just intellectual rejection of moral frameworks, but the courage to create new values based on vital affirmation rather than self-denial. The first profound implication is psychological. If we've been taught to find meaning in suffering, authentic human development requires distinguishing between unavoidable pain and its unnecessary glorification. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, the most spiritual men, as the strongest, find their happiness where others would find their destruction, in the labyrinth, in hardness against themselves and others, in experiments. This isn't celebration of suffering, but recognition that resistance to unnecessary pain, not its passive acceptance, creates strength, that authentic human development emerges not from embracing suffering as virtue, but from overcoming conditions that perpetuate unnecessary pain. The second implication is ethical. If moral systems have sanctified suffering primarily to make it bearable rather than to eliminate it, authentic ethical development requires values based on vital affirmation rather than self-denial. As Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, what is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. This isn't rejection of ethics, but recognition that authentic human flourishing emerges not from moral frameworks that sanctify pain, but from values that enhance vital human capacities without unnecessary constraints. The third implication is social. If the valorization of suffering has often functioned to maintain systems that perpetuate unnecessary pain, social progress requires challenging rather than sanctifying these systems. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't crude celebration of domination, but recognition that authentic human flourishing requires challenging systems that diminish human potential rather than finding spiritual meaning in the suffering these systems create. Perhaps the most profound implication is transformative. If the sanctification of suffering has functioned primarily to domesticate humanity, to make humans more tolerant of diminishment, then liberating human potential requires values beyond moral frameworks that glorify pain. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "I love those who do not first seek beyond the stars for reasons to go down and to be sacrifices, but who sacrifice themselves to the earth, that the earth may someday become the overman's." This isn't rejection of sacrifice, but recognition that authentic human development emerges not from sacrificing life to transcendent ideals, but from enhancing life's vital potentials. What does this mean for how we approach suffering, virtue, and human flourishing? If we've been taught to find meaning in pain, what might become possible if we distinguished between unavoidable suffering and its unnecessary glorification? What form of human development might emerge if we stepped beyond moral frameworks that sanctify pain and embraced values based on vital affirmation rather than self-denial? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic human flourishing begins not with more perfect moral virtue, but with the courage to question moral frameworks themselves, to ask whether what we've been taught to call virtue might actually be something very different. The liberation of humanity from the sanctification of suffering might be not only personally transformative, but culturally revolutionary, releasing vital human energies previously trapped in sophisticated mechanisms of self-diminishment disguised as virtue. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond individual psychology into what might be called a conspiracy of morality, a collective cultural agreement to sanctify suffering for purposes that have little to do with enhancing human flourishing. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution, driven by the interests of moral systems designed primarily for social control rather than human development. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the development of moral frameworks that transformed natural human responses into their opposites. What began as external constraints imposed by social necessity gradually evolved into internal constraints imposed by moral concepts. Concepts that effectively turned people against their own vital energies by making them feel virtuous for embracing suffering and guilty for seeking flourishing. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the fundamental interests of moral systems themselves. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, everything that elevates an individual above the herd and intimidates the neighbor is henceforth called evil. This isn't merely provocative language, but recognition that moral systems evolve to serve the interests of social stability and control, and few psychological mechanisms serve these interests more effectively than the sanctification of suffering. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different domains. Religious institutions promote conceptions of virtue that emphasize patient endurance of suffering. Educational systems teach children that character emerges through hardship rather than flourishing. Therapeutic approaches sometimes reinforce the idea that meaning emerges primarily through struggle rather than joy. Each domain develops its own language, but the psychological function remains consistent, sanctifying suffering in ways that make it more bearable without necessarily addressing its causes. The conspiracy extends into cultural narratives about personal development, where stories of character formation consistently emphasize suffering as the primary catalyst for growth. It appears in social expectations, where those who endure hardship silently are considered more virtuous than those who challenge unnecessary pain. It emerges in political frameworks, where challenging systems that perpetuate suffering is often seen as less virtuous than patiently enduring their effects. The pattern persists. Pain is systematically transformed from natural adversity into moral opportunity. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability. As traditional religious frameworks lose cultural authority, the same psychological mechanism continues through secular forms. Therapeutic languages of post-traumatic growth, self-help narratives of necessary suffering, philosophical frameworks that find meaning primarily in adversity rather than joy. Different language, same psychological function, sanctifying suffering in ways that make it more bearable without necessarily challenging its unnecessary perpetuation. This recognition reveals something profound about Western psychology, that it often continues the same moral patterns while changing only the surface language. The person who embraces hardship as character building, rather than challenging unnecessary suffering, is engaging in essentially the same psychological mechanism as the religious ascetic, sanctifying pain under the guidance of moral frameworks that benefit from this sanctification. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that suffering had been glorified, but that this glorification serves specific cultural functions, primarily making pain more bearable for those who cannot escape it, and in doing so, reducing their motivation to challenge systems that perpetuate unnecessary suffering. The real conspiracy isn't religious doctrine, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming natural human adversity into sophisticated moral virtue. This pattern raises profound questions about human psychology, cultural evolution, and the possibility of authentic flourishing. If we've been collectively engaged in sanctifying suffering for purposes that have little to do with enhancing human development, what might become possible if we consciously distinguished between unavoidable pain and its unnecessary glorification? What version of humanity might emerge if we stepped beyond the moral frameworks that have domesticated us through the sanctification of suffering? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of genuine transformation, both individual and cultural, in how we understand and experience human flourishing. Why has the systematic sanctification of suffering remained largely unacknowledged, despite its profound influence on Western morality? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in moral frameworks that benefit from this pattern. Addressing it would mean questioning not just specific moral teachings, but the very psychological foundations of Western morality, a prospect simultaneously liberating and terrifying. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility. And few moral mechanisms are more psychologically useful than the ability to find meaning in unavoidable suffering. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the sanctification of suffering. By teaching that pain is spiritually purifying, religious frameworks provide crucial psychological comfort to those experiencing unavoidable suffering, while simultaneously creating powerful mechanisms for social control. It's not that religious leaders consciously promote this pattern, but rather that their entire moral framework depends on maintaining the spiritual value of suffering, the cornerstone of many theological systems. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying character development as emerging primarily through hardship rather than flourishing. From ancient myths to modern films, dominant cultural stories often celebrate precisely those aspects of suffering that make it more psychologically bearable. Its supposed role in building character, revealing truth, or demonstrating virtue. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural systems that benefit from making suffering meaningful rather than merely adverse. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching children that character emerges primarily through enduring hardship rather than flourishing in favorable conditions. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What if pleasure and displeasure were so tied together that whoever wanted to have as much as possible of one must also have as much as possible of the other? You have the choice, either as little displeasure as possible, painlessness in brief, or as much displeasure as possible, as the price for the growth of an abundance of subtle pleasures and joys." This insight reveals how education might serve not just to transmit knowledge, but to perpetuate moral frameworks that sanctify suffering rather than enhancing vital human capacities. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but confronting the collapse of the entire moral framework that has structured Western understanding of virtue, meaning, and human development. This prospect is so psychologically challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of moral frameworks, even if they come at the cost of full human flourishing. The pattern persists, not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for meaningful suffering over meaningless pain, for moral certainty over existential ambiguity, and for the comfort of virtue over the challenge of creating values beyond good and evil. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, after Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. This passage reveals his recognition that moving beyond the moral sanctification of suffering requires not just rejecting specific beliefs, but creating new values beyond the shadow of traditional morality, a task both liberating and terrifying. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic human flourishing and genuine human development? If we've been collectively engaged in sanctifying suffering for purposes that have little to do with enhancing human potential, what might become possible if we consciously distinguished between unavoidable pain and its unnecessary glorification? What version of humanity might emerge if we stepped beyond the moral frameworks that have domesticated us through the sanctification of suffering? The final question isn't whether suffering exists, but whether pain should be transformed into virtue. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about human psychology, our tendency to make suffering meaningful rather than merely adverse. But it also reveals something even more significant, the possibility of human flourishing beyond the moral sanctification of pain, a form of development that emerges not from embracing suffering as virtue, but from enhancing life's vital potentials without unnecessary constraints. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of amor fati, the love of fate not as passive acceptance of suffering but as active embrace of life in its entirety. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it. This isn't celebration of suffering, but recognition that authentic human development emerges not from sanctifying pain, but from transforming all experience, including unavoidable suffering, into opportunity for vital enhancement rather than moral virtue. This isn't about rejecting meaning, but transforming how we create it, moving from a framework that finds meaning primarily in suffering to one that creates meaning through vital affirmation. Perhaps authentic human development isn't measured by how much pain you willingly embrace, but by how fully you enhance life's potentials, not just your own, but those of others as well, not just despite suffering, but sometimes through its necessary transformation or elimination. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to suffering, noticing when you valorize pain as inherently meaningful rather than sometimes merely adverse. It means asking whether your conception of virtue enhances your vital flourishing or constrains it through sophisticated mechanisms of self-diminishment. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, "everything happens for a reason," or "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," to transform potentially meaningless suffering into moral significance. It means developing a relationship to unavoidable pain that neither denies its reality nor sanctifies it as virtue. Illness not as moral opportunity, but as natural adversity that sometimes must be endured but need not be celebrated. Hardship not as character-building exercise, but as condition that sometimes catalyzes growth but often merely diminishes. Sacrifice not as inherent virtue, but as sometimes necessary cost that should be evaluated rather than automatically valorized. Most importantly, it means recognizing that the voice that emerges when you stop sanctifying suffering isn't hedonistic indulgence, but authentic flourishing, what Nietzsche called the will to power in its genuine sense, not as domination, but as enhancement of life's vital potentials. This isn't arbitrary self-indulgence, but recognition that authentic human development emerges most powerfully, not from embracing pain as virtue, but from enhancing life's capacities without unnecessary moral constraints. The path forward isn't about embracing suffering, but liberating human potential from its unnecessary sanctification. Whether within traditional moral frameworks or beyond them, authentic human development requires distinguishing between unavoidable pain and its unnecessary glorification, between the natural human response to adversity and its artificial transformation into moral virtue. What might become possible if you stopped sanctifying suffering as inherently meaningful? What forms of human development might emerge if you distinguished between unavoidable pain and its unnecessary glorification? What potential might you discover if you separated natural human resilience from the artificial virtue of willing self-diminishment? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect moral virtue, but from the courage to question moral frameworks themselves, to ask whether what you've been taught to call virtue might actually be a sophisticated mechanism for domestication. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "I love him whose soul is so overfull that he forgets himself, and all things are in him. Thus all things become his going under." This isn't about forgetting suffering, but transforming how we relate to it, not as proof of virtue, but as sometimes necessary aspect of a life dedicated to enhancement rather than constraint. The real journey isn't finding more meaning in suffering, but liberating human potential from its unnecessary sanctification. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that we need more virtuous pain, but that we need to distinguish between unavoidable suffering and its unnecessary glorification, between pain as natural adversity and pain as sophisticated mechanism for human domestication. As Nietzsche ultimately suggests, true human development begins not with more perfect suffering, but with the courage to question whether suffering should be meaningful at all. Perhaps authentic flourishing emerges not from how virtuously you embrace pain, but from how fully you enhance life's potentials, not just despite suffering, but sometimes through its necessary transformation or elimination. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating truth of all is that suffering doesn't purify. It merely domesticates.